Applause for our speakers, Saul Kripke and Romina Padro.
So here is an argument. Consider a subject A, a person, and any statement P. This can be anything now. P entails the following. Any evidence against P is misleading, where misleading is meant leads to a false conclusion, right? Because, I mean, if P is the case, then any evidence against P is misleading. 2, if A knows that P, and A knows that P entails Q, and on the basis of such knowledge, A concludes that Q, then A knows that Q, there are philosophers who have denied that Q holds in general, but these are special cases about philosophical skepticism. If one didn't generally accept 2 and thought that it was usually or in general wrong, one might criticize someone for the fallacy of giving a valid argument for a conclusion, right? And of course, that is not in general a fallacy. So if we know some premises and we know what it entails, then if A concludes that Q, then A knows that Q. Suppose the subject A knows that P and knows 2, or really all we really need is that 2 is true, right? Then A knows that any evidence against P is misleading. Note that the argument applies to any evidence arising now or alleged evidence, right? We should really say arising now or in the future. This already may seem very strange that just by knowing some common or garden variety statement, which I am calling P, and this can be more or less anything you like, right? One knows a sweeping thing that any future evidence against P will be misleading. But of course, that does follow from P itself. We might also have as a general principle, so this is something else now, right? Though it is very hard to state in a nice, rigorous way, especially giving it the necessary generality. If A knows that taking an action of type T leads to a consequence C, and A wishes above all else to avoid C, that is, that this is the only relevant issue and there aren't counter considerations or whatever, then A should resolve now not to take any action of type T. This too is a very sweeping statement, but we are considering the case where A knows at a certain time that if she does anything of a certain kind in the future, it will lead to a consequence that she thinks is bad, there being no other relevant consequences which would override it. For example, suppose she knows that if she opens the door, someone outside is going to shoot her. It would be a reasonable thing for her to resolve not to open the door. So she should resolve not to take any action of type T. Let the action of type T be accepting evidence against P, that is, doubting or denying that P on the basis of some future evidence. The consequence C is gaining a false belief, or at least losing a true one, if we were merely fall into doubt, and this is something that we do not want. Then we may conclude A should resolve not to be influenced by any evidence against P. Notice that there are 2 ways in which one can make this resolution. In the first place, one can resolve not to look at any alleged evidence against P. For example, I might resolve not to read books of a certain type that I know might contain this misleading evidence. I think that in practice, this is the most important case. In the second case, one could resolve that even if it was faced, regardless of whether one wanted it, with particular evidence against P, one should nevertheless ignore it, since one knows that it must be misleading, given that one knows that P, we who are not dogmatists may not have these attitudes, but I wanted to mention, especially in the first type of place of the resolution, of course, various political and religious leaders, some of them may not really think that we know that P, but some of them do, and in both cases they may simply try to prevent the public from seeing the alleged evidence against P, where P is something that they know is true, and they know that such evidence is misleading, so they might try to prevent people from ever seeing it. The second case is a little different from the first because one is forced to see the alleged evidence. Right. Now, neither of these things seem to be our attitude, our non-dogmatic attitude towards future evidence in cases where we know something. So there must be something else wrong, and this is the question: what is wrong? Okay, and Romina will continue with some reservation about this being wrong.
The paradox can be stated as a question, right? If we know that P, why should we consider any evidence against P? What Saul was just saying is that there might be certain cases where the attitude of the dogmatist is okay or needed. Let P be something like, I don't know, the principle of attraction, or I don't know, that Elvis is alive. That we know that is false, right?
Yeah,
and
Elvis is dead, right?
yes, and the principle of attraction is false. In those cases, there seems to be reasons for me to actually take this attitude of not consider any evidence against P. What you were saying, that this is not the attitude that we have, I think that implicitly we do have this attitude, because we can't really be testing all things that we know continuously, right? We are finite beings, and there are things that we just ignore. I go to the supermarket and I don't look at the newspapers that say that Elvis is alive. You get the sense that we should keep an open attitude and always allow evidence against our beliefs. But on the other hand, it makes sense that in certain cases, we do not keep this open attitude, right? Now, the problem is how we find the principal way to tell the cases apart. One thing that one can think is that if you take this attitude in the cases where it is warranted, perhaps then you will slip also in the cases where it's not so warranted, so you should stay away from that. Given that we are finite beings, it's almost as needed that we take this attitude in certain cases.
Now, I myself mentioned, I think I quote Stephen Weinberg as saying that he hasn't read literature advocating that astrology or necromancy or witchcraft. And I myself once encountered something by someone reasonably well known in this country, or he was, right, purporting to argue for the theories of a certain French astrologer, right? And just thought, well, this has got to be wrong, right? Yeah, right.
Also, you can think that why would I have to be punished for knowing that P and having to go evidence that is, no good at all? Actually, many philosophers that reply to this dogmatism paradox that Saul invented try to solve it. But one of the problems with the solutions that they give is that they usually take it to be the case that it's not a resolution that you make in advance. It's a resolution that you make later on, once you already confronted the evidence. And in that case, you may have lost already your confidence in P, or you may start doubting it. Or
The main thing is to make a resolution not to look at any such evidence, so one is not confronted with it, right? The solution is not, as some have argued, that once you've seen the evidence against P, you no longer know it because you've fallen into doubt. Because the thing is to try to avoid ever getting into such a situation, right? Because you know that the alleged evidence will be misleading.
One could think that taking the dogmatist attitude in this case would show some failure of the agent on being, reliable. I don't think that I should be considered in some sense shady for taking this attitude. I think that I should be commended for taking this attitude.
Yes, well, I know it only because I take it that the scientists have concluded that.
One important thing is that here everything is seen from the perspective of the third person, right? Whether it would be rational for a nation to take this attitude.
Yes.
But from the perspective of the agent herself, there will be a different position, because you could argue that you need to know that you know that P to be warranted in this attitude. But from the perspective of the first person, right? Yeah. But that's a different question. The idea is, when we analyze it, we think that it does make sense to take this attitude, for a nation to take this attitude, that it wouldn't be rational, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that the dogmatist attitude could be considered rational.
Yeah.
In certain cases.
In certain cases. Other cases, it would be considered irrational, and it is not so easy on the basis of this kind of argument to differentiate them.
Yeah, so basically we do not have a resolution of this. It's a puzzle. I think it's interesting thinking that there are limitations that we have to acknowledge, and because of that, we have to take attitudes that maybe are not commendable in all cases, but in certain cases are warranted, just because we are finite beings.
Yes, yes. Well, finite beings, I mean, we're not really infallible, is what you mean.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
No,
Yeah.
And we are going to die. We don't have time for this.
Time for what?
For considering evidence.
Oh, so you actually think maybe it's right always, or what?
No, not always, but in certain cases
Certain
where
cases
where
it
it's
is.
obvious, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it's almost needed.
Yes. Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yes. Well. Yeah. Well, I mean, in some cases, one just should not worry about looking at supposed evidence against some things that have been established.
And an important point I think that you make in the paper is that this paradox would seem to lead either to skepticism and think that there is no knowledge.
Yeah, but of course that's not right.
Right. Or to a complete dogmatist attitude.
Complete dogmatist attitude, yeah. No, the whole thing is about the dogmatist attitude, so that's, but of course, if no one knows anything, right, that would be another type of resolution, right, at least as long as this is about knowledge.
Right.
Right, and that would be complete skepticism, which has probably been, I don't know if anyone has advocated that actually,
And-
complete philosophical skepticism, but
And the opposite would be
the dogmatist.
the dogmatist attitude.
Yeah.
And so the idea is, well, how we stay in the middle and
Okay.
make sense of it.
For more debates, talks, and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.